think about this psalm, as Simon said, this is an ancient song or an ancient poem. It's good for us to think about a little bit about the context. Psalm 103, we're told, is a psalm of David. Psalm 3 is a psalm of David. And it's a psalm that he wrote, or a song that he wrote, when he was on the run from none other than his own son, Absalom. So if you've got a Bible in front of you, you'll see it says, a psalm of David when he fled from his son, Absalom. What had happened is, Absalom's brother, Amnon, committed a terrible crime against Absalom's sisters. I say brothers and sisters, they were all half brothers and sisters. And Amnon had raped his sister. A terrible thing to do. And Absalom bided his time, and in his time murdered his brother. Having murdered his brother, Absalom was then kind of banished from the kingdom, but ended up being brought back in by David. But somewhat estranged still from David, his father. And during that time, Absalom, the Bible says, stole the hearts of the people. So that the Israelites, the Jews, the people then, they more and more were gathering behind Absalom rather than David, until Absalom's strength grew and he was able to displace David so that David was on the run. Absalom hunted him down, wanted to take his life. And during that time, can you imagine what it's like? Your own child who you love hunting you down, wanting to kill you. You've not done anything wrong to him. He's killed one of your sons. Now he's after you. Well, that was King David's situation. And there are many that are after him. And so what we're going to do is, bearing that in mind, we're going to just break this down and begin by thinking about David's enemy. So David's enemy was his own son and his own people who were trying to actually kill him. They actually wanted to take his life. They would approach him sword in hand. That was it. They wanted to literally take his life. They were his enemies. And as we come to this psalm, we might think, well, what has this got to do with me? What could David's plight all those thousands of years ago, what could that have to do with me? What relevance could it possibly have? Well, I want to suggest that in many ways, we too do have enemies. All of us. According to the scriptures, we all have enemies. And it's good for us to know our enemies. David came to know that his son and his people were his enemy. However, we need to look at the scriptures and see what they say about who our enemies are. So the first verse that we're going to look at is in Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 19. The Apostle Paul writes to the church, and he wants to make this crystal clear. He says, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood." We might think of people as our enemies, but Paul writes and makes it clear, for David, people were his enemies, his own son, and many others. But for us, our struggle, our enemy is not against flesh and blood. Whoever you might think of, whatever people you might think of, you can think of people as being enemies. The Bible says no. Flesh and blood are not our enemies. 1 Peter chapter 2. Well, before we turn to that, actually, staying in Ephesians chapter 6, it says, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. So people aren't our enemies, but there are spiritual forces at work that are malign forces. They hate us. Okay, so just hold that in mind. Paul says, people are not your enemies. When you look around and you look around at people in Brighton, they're not our enemies, folks. In fact, Jesus says those that may appear to be our enemies, what does he say? He says, love your enemies. And for those who oppose us, even if they oppose us strongly, what does Jesus say? Pray for those who persecute you. They're not our enemies, as tempting as it might be to think of them as such. When they hurt us, when they persecute us or anything like that, they are not our enemies. So, what is our enemies? The spiritual forces of evil. Yes, the Bible tells us that there are spiritual forces at play in this world in which we live. Now, that idea is can sound a bit crazy to moderns today. You know, the idea of spiritual forces of evil. There's no such thing as spiritual forces. That's what many people would tell us. People who would be materialists. They say all there is just the physical matter. But I think when we look around at the world, I think there's plenty to suggest that there is a power at work in this world, a malign power. If you was to do a survey, I did a whole number of surveys actually over this last week, but if you was to do a survey all over Brighton, and you could probably do this all over the world, asking people, do you want peace? Would you want world peace? How many people do you think would say no? Very few. Everyone wants peace. Everyone wants security. Yet we live in a world that within families there's a lack of peace. In relationships, families being torn apart, people struggling to stay together. At that level there's a lack of peace, right up to a global level. Nations mistrusting one another. War, civil war. And where there's civil war, the demon of war raises its ugly head, doesn't it? Terrible atrocities happen. I mean, whatever you might think of that is completely unthinkable, that is happening somewhere in this world. It's beyond, it's one thing, people getting angry and hurting one another. It's another thing, there's an evil that overtakes people so that they go much further in darkness and commit terrible atrocities. And it's really hard. So that even materialists would say that is evil. It's evil. It's more than just people being bad. It's evil. And Paul says we need to have our eyes open. If we're just materialistic in our thinking, we will never, ever be able to live, as it were, victoriously in life. Because we're not taking account of a spiritual power at work in this world. Bible gives that power a name, Satan, the devil. Speaks of demons. Yeah, they're very real according to the scriptures. And I think it's the only way to explain so much of what we see in this world. People overtaken by evil. Evidence of it everywhere. So we have an enemy, but it's not flesh and blood. Okay, well, that's not entirely the case when I say it's not flesh and blood. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11 tells us about another war, another enemy against us. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 11. Dear friends, I urge you as strangers and exiles to abstain, listen to what he says, from sinful desires that wage war against the soul. Do you see that? Flesh and blood, other people are not your enemy. Actually, there is an enemy, though, of flesh and blood. And it's our own sinful desires. And we all have them. Every single one of us have sinful desires. Just imagine for a moment that you decided one day, today, I'm just going to follow whatever desires I have. You know, imagine, because I think a lot of the time, what we do is we constrain ourselves, don't we? We might think a thought about someone, but we are definitely not going to say it, right? We're all guilty of that. Well, I say guilty. Thankfully, we don't say it. Can you imagine we said everything that came into our minds? That who we are on the inside, imagine that was being worked out all the time. I don't think any of us would have any friends, would we? It's true, isn't it? It's true. We have sinful desires. And they wage war against our soul. In other words, if you was to follow those sinful desires, they will destroy you. They will be so destructive. You know, there are people in this world who do follow their sinful desires. And we see it, don't we? You know, and it ruins relationships. Absolutely, it hurts people. We see the consequences of sinful desires all over the world. And as a political leader desires more power. And so they try to annex another nation with devastating consequences. Yeah, it's so easy for them to just press buttons and launch missiles. Terrible that one person would do that. Sinful desires at every level. In all of our relationships, again, at every level. Sinful desires that wage war against your soul. You know, it's so easy, isn't it, to look at other people and blame other people for stuff. But Peter's telling us we need to realize that actually the biggest problem that we all face is ourself. Our own sinful self. And in Romans chapter 7 and verse 23, again, this is the Apostle Paul speaking, says a similar thing. Romans 7 verse 23, if you listen up. And so if you've got a church Bible, I think it's page 1002. He says, but he's speaking about anyone who's trying to live a life that would please God without Jesus, not relying on Jesus. He says, as I'll read from verse 22, he says, for in my inner self, so in myself, he says, I delight in God's law. He's saying, I want to be good. I want to do good in my inner self, but I see a different law or a different principle in the parts of my body waging war against the law of my mind and taking me prisoner to the law of sin in the parts of my body. In other words, he's saying, I want to do good, and in fact he literally says this throughout this passage. He says, I want to do good. I think today I'm going to do good, and I end up doing bad. I do the very things I don't want to do. It's true. If you was to take just 10 seconds, okay, if we was to take a break for 10 seconds, and you think, I'm only going to think pure thoughts, you're going to find that hard. Because the moment you set your mind on, I'm just going to think pure thoughts, other things start coming in, you know? It almost provokes us. The desire to do good almost provokes us to do bad. So that people, again, because of our own sinfulness, we shipwreck our own lives. So we've got this thing going on within us, a war that wages within. We have an enemy within. I guess most of you are familiar with Pinocchio, yeah? He tells lies, his nose grows. But in Pinocchio, there's Jiminy Cricket, isn't there? He's got his conscience on one shoulder. And often we're given this picture, aren't we, of people on one shoulder. Sometimes it's an image of the devil, and on the other shoulder, an angel. You ever seen that sort of thing? And the angel's telling you to do good, the devil's telling you to do bad, and there's these two voices, and it's like, what should I do, right? Now, that's a fairly comical picture of something of a reality. There is something in us, a part of us that wants to do good, but at the same time, there's constant temptation and a battle to do what's wrong. And when we go to do what's wrong, there's a voice saying, don't do it. You know that it's wrong. And when we go to do good, when we think, I'm not going to do the wrong, then there's another part of us that really wants to do it. We have this, what the Bible calls a sinful, broken, rebellious nature. So, we have these two enemies. It's important to know your enemy. Now, what does this enemy do? Going back to Psalm 3. We're going to be staying now in Psalm 3 a bit more. David says, Lord, how many are my foes? There are many who attack me. We've just been thinking about our enemy, not flesh and blood, but spiritual forces of evil and that which is within. Okay? And he says, Lord, how my foes increase. There are many who attack me. Many say about me, there is no help for him in God. So, these enemies that want to take a hold of us and lead us into devastation and to destruction, into ruining our relationships. They pose a threat. We constantly live with the threat of things that, if not handled well, will be destructive. So for David, it's the enemies out there. They're a threat. Now you can imagine what it was like for David, being hunted down, going to bed at night. I mean, imagine it was you would probably be full of anxiety. I probably would be. Thinking about, man, what if he gets to me tonight? You know? Things that worry us. And that feels like a threat. David tells us, though, the sort of what happens what's at the core of this threat. It says this, many say about me, there is no help for him in God. You see, whether it's the powers of evil at work or whether it is our own sinfulness at work, a message that we can start to believe is, look, I'm on my own and I have somehow got to navigate my way through these challenges. Okay? And so we go to bed at night worrying about the things that are pressing in, that are threatening us in some way. The things that make us feel insecure. And it could be all kinds of things. Yeah, when you boil it down, there are many things that can feel like a threat in life that cause anxiety. I mean, how many people today are struggling with anxiety? It's rampant. It's like a pandemic. The amount of people, they just can't get any peace. And David's in that position. There's this threat around him. But it boils down to this, that the biggest problem is this. Many are saying there is no help for him in God. In other words, we're on our own. You know, that's a lie that we can believe as we go through life trying to manage the challenges that we face, the things that threaten us. We can think there is no help in God for me. And when we think there is no help in God, what do? We rely on ourselves. And when we rely on ourselves, that is when we get into all kinds of trouble, because we don't know the end from the beginning, do we? We don't know what the consequences of our best efforts might be. We don't know how to handle situations. We don't know what is the best decision to make. We don't know. We can hazard a guess. We can hope. But if we're relying on self, we're often not strong enough to resist certain temptations. We're not wise enough. We don't have the knowledge. We don't have the insight. Big security for many people at the moment. Whole lives ahead of us. can I make it? Can I cut it? Lots of fears that come in there. Well, for David, there's this voice saying, or voices saying, there is no help for him in God. Leads to self-reliance. This is probably, in terms of the spiritual forces of evil, the number one thing that they want to persuade every single one of us of is that God is not reliable. Jesus is not reliable. You have to do it yourself. Rely on yourself. Lord, how my foes increase. There are many who attack me. Many say about me, there is no help for him in God. If David was to believe that, he would be done for. But then verse 3, what happens? He says, but you are a shield around me, my glory, and the one who lifts my head. This is the posture of faith. So we want to know our enemy, but there's the posture of faith. David takes that posture. He says, there's people saying, I can't rely on God, but God, you are a shield around me. In you, I have protection. What does it mean to have faith? It means this. I'll give you 4 things that it means. And there could be other things that you could add to this. But faith is believing God's promises. Believing God's promises, trusting God's promises, relying on God's promises, and walking according to God's promises. That's faith. The things that God has promised. There are things he hasn't promised, but there are things he has promised. And this is why, brothers and sisters, friends, it's really important for you to know what are the promises of God. If you don't know what they are, it's very difficult to have faith. What has he promised? What hasn't he promised? To know specifically. So faith is relying on the word and the promises of God. God said to Abraham, I will be your shield, your very great reward. David believes that. He says, you're my shield. I've got all these enemies. They're going to kill me. They could kill me, but I'm trusting in you. You're my shield. So David's is a posture of faith, even though others are saying God's not going to help him. So there's this lie pressing in, and he's pushing back, saying, no, I'm trusting in God. He is trustworthy. He is my shield. That's his position, his posture. Romans chapter 10, verse 11. Again, the Apostle Paul says, anyone or whoever trusts in the Lord will never be put to shame. That's a promise. You can take that to the bank. Posture, the posture of faith. This is what we see in David, a posture of faith. First, he knows his enemy. There's the posture of faith. And then there's the prayer of faith. But you, Lord, are a shield around me, my glory, and the one who lifts my head. I cry aloud to the Lord, and he answers me. This is the most wonderful thing. Any one of you who's come to know the Lord, you know what it's like, don't you? When God speaks. When you hear God speak. David cries out to the Lord. He says, and God answers me. You don't just cry out and it just goes up there somewhere and into the ether, nothing coming back, He says, I cry out to the Lord. He has faith, that posture of faith. You're my shield, and therefore I cry out to him, and he answers me. God speaks into our situations. And when he speaks into those situations that would otherwise be places of doubt and fear, when he speaks, his word in a very real, a very powerful way imparts, gives us peace. Again, look at what David says. This is the peace of faith. He says, I cried out aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy mountain. I lie down and sleep. Isn't that a wonderful thing? How many times do you have sleepless nights? Sleepless nights, full of anxiety, worrying about these things that threaten, enemies. David says, I trust in the Lord. I cry out to him, he answers me, and he takes that word. He says, I have peace. I lay down and I sleep. I wake again because the Lord sustains me. What he's saying is, I actually don't need to worry. Even though there's these enemies, I've got very real enemies that David had, I don't need to worry. I can trust, I can rely on God. He'll sustain me. He'll protect me. I love the 23rd Psalm, I'm sure you do too, where he says, though the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leads me by still waters. Well, the second part of the stanzas goes something like this. He says, though my enemies surround me, you prepare a table before me, and my cup, it overflows. The picture, David's painting a picture there of, you imagine like mountains all around, and on the perimeter of the mountains are his enemies with their weapons in their hands, and they're going to descend down the mountain to get him, right? He says, so he arrives in this place, he sees all these people, but what's there before he even gets there is the Lord. And the Lord said, it says prepared. There's already a table there. He gets there, and there's a table prepared. So the Lord was already there. In that dangerous place, the Lord is already there. And he says, he prepares a table before my enemies. And David feels such safety, he can sit down, as it were, and enjoy the feast. He says, my cup overflows. This is insane, almost. To be surrounded by enemies and yet have such peace, not just peace, but joy. This is what David is talking about here. I lie down and sleep. I wake again because the Lord sustains me. That's the prayer of faith and the peace of faith. And then lastly, the practice, actually not lastly, second to lastly, the practice of faith. Faith is not passive. Okay, so David doesn't say to himself, God's my shield, I don't need to worry, I'm just going to go to sleep. He doesn't just do that. He does something. He prays. You see, God has made these promises, but God wants us to enter into relationship with him. And it's in the relationship with him, as we relate to him, as we speak to him, as we hear from him, it's in that relationship that we receive and know his peace, that we know the reality of him in our lives. So we don't just go through difficult times saying, I know that God's going to be faithful. He is. And he'll be faithful even then, very often. Well, always he's faithful. But he wants us to know that relationship with him. He wants us to know the joy of finding him in that place that we would otherwise never be able to survive, or that would destroy us, would be undone by it. He wants us to know him in that situation. And so he prays. He says in verse 6, I will not be afraid of thousands of people who have taken their stand against me on every side. He says, I'm not going to be afraid. What's he going to do? He prays. Rise up, Lord, he says, verse 7. Rise up, Lord, save me, my God. He says, and notice what he says. He says, you strike my enemies on the cheek or on the jaw, your version might say. You break the teeth of the wicked. That's a fairly brutal picture, isn't it? When I first read that, I kind of think about someone taking a cricket bat or a baseball bat and smashing someone in the face. You strike my enemies on the face, you break their teeth. But that's not really the picture that David is giving us. Why the jaw? Why the teeth? What's that about? Well, you see, it's with our mouth that we speak. And the biggest problem, the biggest weapon, as it were, of his enemies is what they say. There is no help for God. There is no help for him in God. This is the terrible lie of the evil one. There is no help for you. This is what this world is flooded with lies. And at the root of them is that one lie. You can't rely on God. You can't rely on Jesus. In your moment of need, he won't help you. You got to work it out yourself. You're on your own. You can't trust him. David says, rise up, Lord. Smash that lie is what he's saying. Absolutely obliterate it. And show yourself faithful. And then the psalm ends with this: salvation belongs to the Lord. May your blessings be on your people. You know, the last thing to draw from this is the picture of faith. The whole of the Old Testament is pointing forward to Jesus. It's all about Jesus. Jesus tells us that. It's all about him. And Jesus is the supreme picture of faith and faithfulness. When he was on the cross, being crucified, stripped naked, utterly humiliated, what were people shouting out? What does it say? That was a week before, or the few days before crucify him. But when he was actually on the cross, they said he trusts in God. Let God rescue him. Do you think they were thinking God was going to rescue him? No. That was a taunt. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. You know? There was Jesus. It would have been easy to think. In fact, he cried out, didn't he? It says he cried out in a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me? And he hung there on the cross. We read it a few moments ago, that the Lord, anyone who trusts in the Lord will never be put to shame. But what happened to Jesus? He was put to shame, wasn't he? He was put to shame. But you know, as he hung there on the cross, absolutely abandoned, he was abandoned so that we would not be abandoned. The fact that he was abandoned is the guarantee that God will not abandon us. You see, we all deserve to be abandoned by God. But Jesus took our place, and he experienced the abandonment even by God, that we might not. But that's not the whole picture, because Jesus, in faith, nailed to the cross, took upon himself all the wickedness, right there, all the wickedness, evil, shame of this world. It was all loaded onto him. But what happened? 3 days later, he was raised to life. And his resurrection was his vindication. He really, all the shame that was heaped on him, his resurrection was God saying, no, actually, he is my son. He has every right to life. And the Bible tells us in Philippians chapter 2 that he's been raised to the highest place, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Every knee will bow. Every tongue will confess Jesus is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. God did not abandon his Son ultimately, because God is faithful. So, as we draw to a close, know your enemy. Your enemy isn't people out there. They're not our enemy, right? We're to love people. Our biggest enemy, there are powers and forces at work against us, and there's our own sinfulness. This is our enemy. How do we gain victory? By faith. Trusting in his word, that posture of faith. By prayer, calling upon the Lord. And by hearing his voice and knowing his peace. Even in our struggles. Let's pray.